I just want to start, apart from more technical problems, by thanking you for inviting me to speak with you this morning to join your celebrations of 30 years of LEADER. I'm delighted and honoured to be here. I've always been a supporter of LEADER. In my bio, it says that not only did I do some evaluations of LEADER 1 and LEADER 2, and I was involved in some of the selection decisions in England in later years for LEADER Plus and so on. But I was also a LAG member way back in LEADER 2. So I've seen LEADER from different perspectives, and I've learned so much from your experience in Ireland. So if we move to the second slide, please, James. And of course, LEADER originates in Ireland. LEADER's said to originate in Kitty O'Shea's pub in Brussels, where Ray McSharry and his cabinet were discussing cap reform, what to do, and contemplating cuts in price support under the cap. Officials had the idea of a new territorial approach to rural development. The idea was that it would start as a pilot scheme, but it would grow to become the main pillar of the cap, not pillar 2, but the main pillar, as budgets were refocused from sectoral agricultural support towards territorial place-based actions. And of course, that was the main thrust of the Cork Declaration. That didn't happen, but LEADER has continued and thrived, and it's been widely recognized throughout the world as a very important and indeed paradigmatic approach to rural development, as recognized by the OECD in the new rural paradigm. Next slide, please. Ireland not only originated the idea of LEADER, the concept was then worked out and pioneered in Ireland. And there are many evaluations and academic studies and articles and papers on rural development which promoted it and explained it and helped develop it. And these in the pictures here are just a few of the studies from my own bookshelves of studies which influenced LEADER and integrated rural development across Europe, emphasizing the importance of local participation, animation and capacity building, social inclusion, partnerships, and a strategic approach. And some of the people who were involved in this, people that many of them I got to know. Patrick Commins, I got to know very well. Brendan Kearney, Jerry Boyle, Jim Walsh, with a very influential evaluation of LEADER 1 in Ireland. Michael Murner, Michael Kane, Pat O'Hara, and many, many others had a huge role in documenting and disseminating these ideas across Europe. Next slide, please, James. And it wasn't only the people writing about LEADER, it was the people doing LEADER. LEADER practice in Ireland was also hugely influential. From LEADER 1 to LEADER CLLD today, inspiration has come from the innovative practices of Ireland's local action groups, with inspirational leaders like Carmel Fox and Maura Walsh, who I got to know many years ago at the Cork conference. And of course, many, many thousands more people, as the Minister has said, are involved in that today. So what is it about LEADER which has been so effective? Obviously, you know the story of LEADER in Ireland far better than I do, so I'm not going to presume to tell you anything about the story of LEADER in Ireland. That's something which can emerge in panel and in the breakout groups. So what I'll do is draw on my own studies of LEADER across Europe to reflect more generally on LEADER, and hope that there are some issues and some points in my reflections which are relevant to you discussing the future of LEADER in Ireland as well. So the next slide, please, James. At the top left here, you can see the LEADER principles, the LEADER approach, which you're all really familiar with. So I'm not going to go through that. I'll be referring to many of those points as I go. But it's always seemed to me that this is an example, a very, very important example of what I've called networked rural development. Networked rural development involves local control and capacity building at the local level, but recognizes in addition the essential role of the state and other external actors like universities at multiple scales. And the features that I see in it are building institutional capacity to act, drawing on knowledge resources, network resources, the connections you have with other places and markets and government and so on. The development of a collective vision and a collective capacity to act. And of course, attention to social inclusion and active participation, so that it's not just the vocal few, but everybody has a say and who has a stake. But as I've said, it's important also to think about the enabling state. Leaders often referred to as a bottom-up initiative, but it's not only a bottom-up initiative. It also draws on multiple scales of government, from the EU providing funding and vision of the leader approach and networking groups together across Europe, but also national and regional and local government and many other actors. And their role is, on the one hand, build capacity to act of marginalized individuals and places. Otherwise, it would be sink or swim. The places that actually have that capacity would do well. Other places would be left behind in a sort of two-speed countryside. And also addressing the processes of change at higher levels, non-local forces. That involves things like rural proofing, national policies, and international policies. And I'll go into that a little bit more as we go on. Of course, social innovation is another important feature, and I'll turn to that in more detail in a moment too. But I also want to make the point that local actors can't work only within their own place. It's not just about what happens within the area. Local actors also have to work with the people elsewhere who make decisions which affect them. So they must construct spaces of engagement to secure their local spaces of dependence. And it seems to me that that requires engagement in national and relational networks, trying to build your immunity, if you like, from decisions that other people may take that affect you unthinkingly, but also building powers of initiation, the power to actually make things happen where you are and for others to learn from that. So these are some of the responsibilities of the enabling state and other actors. Now, we know that leaders gone through many phases. They're listed there, all their different names. We're into the sixth phase now. And through those phases, we've had subtle shifts in objectives, in scope, in style, and in control. But still, a leader approach or a leader philosophy is not only identifiable, but it's still celebrated. And I'll try and explain some of the reasons for that too as we go through. Next slide, please, James. I'm going to pick three issues that I've written about just to try and add a little something from my own research. And these three issues, which I think are relevant to the future of leader, are innovation, social inclusion, and spatial justice. So in terms of innovation, prior to leader, rural citizens tended to think of innovation as science policy and as an urban thing, alien to rural areas. It tended to be thought of as knowledge transfer from universities and science parks and that sort of thing. But leader funding required innovation as a criterion for giving an award. And that prompted a new reflexive understanding of what innovation might mean in rural development and rural policy. And that seemed to be social innovation and cultural innovation and knowledge exchange rather than this technology transfer. The territorial approach to rural development itself was seen as innovative. The emphasis on social and cultural innovation, like capacity building, networking, image and identity, placemaking, was itself an innovation. And the attention to rural economies and social inclusion beyond agriculture was an innovation. I do remember one LAG meeting, though, where we had a discussion about whether starting a new funeral parlour in a village that didn't have one would be classed as innovation. And of course, it was classed as innovation because we didn't already have one. So the concept was stretched a little bit. The OECD described this as the new rural paradigm, as I've already said, but researchers found the approach became less innovative and more constrained in later phases in many countries, largely because leader had challenged both clientelistic power relations and the local political class within the region, and hierarchical structures of bureaucratic power beyond the region. So challenging power led to leader, in many cases, being more constrained and cramping the scope for innovation. If I could go to the next slide, please, James. I'm looking now at social inclusion. In a paper in 2000, and gosh, that's 21 years ago now, I warned of the danger that leader could increase inequality both between and within areas because of differential capacity to act, the sink or swim that I was talking about earlier on, helping the people and the places that had the capacity to act and perhaps neglecting the others. And this danger can be amplified by complex application procedures, by an emphasis on capital grants, by short timescales, or by elite capture. Chris Curtin and Tony Varley, indeed, in 1991 found local notables tended to dominate, while Patrick Commins and Michael Keane in 1994 found pre-existing structures of inequality were usually not addressed in early leader phases. So these were real problems which were identified in Ireland as elsewhere. For leader to become more socially inclusive, I argued that more funds should be devoted to targeted animation and capacity building, trying to reach the people who would otherwise not be reached, the so-called Heineken effect. Less emphasis on capital grants and longer timescales, simpler application procedures, and greater diversity in LAG boards. No doubt many more lessons have emerged from Ireland's experience in addressing social inclusion, and I look forward to hearing about some of those in the breakout session shortly. We can move to the third slide of these now, James. We're now on to spatial justice, third theme that I want to pick up on. And this is a very current theme. It's become a priority of the European Union, the European Commission. And the question is, can leader help promote spatial justice? In some of the literature that I was reviewing in preparing for the study that we did, other researchers had identified three particular features that would help leader to promote spatial justice. One would be plurality and diversity, this locally tailored approach, which is so key to leader. Another was active participation and capacity building, which we've been talking about and which you know very well. And the third was governance and power. Actually, these powers of immunity and the powers of initiation that I talked about, the power to actually address the priorities of the area and to prevent bad things being done to derail that from elsewhere. We explored this in the last few years in a case study of the Northumberland Uplands LAG in Northern England, shown on the map there, just near to Newcastle where I work. It's a very attractive area. You can see a picture of Hadrian's Wall there, which goes through the middle of the Northumberland Uplands. The findings that we had were rather worrying. In terms of plurality and diversity, the locally tailored approach, of course, everywhere in Europe, local development strategies are circumscribed by national guidelines and EU funding rules. That goes without saying. But in England, in the last phase, local development strategies were actually displaced by central government directing that priority should be given to jobs and growth, regardless of what local consultations and local development strategies said. And there was a shift to capital grants. Both of those increased the bureaucratic control by a managing agency, reduced the power of LAGs to actually do what the people in their areas had said they wanted done, reduced the powers to include those who found it harder to apply for grants and didn't have the capital. In terms of active participation and capacity building, the local development strategy had involved a very widespread consultation, done very, very well, with a lot of active participation. But the program itself restricted how much of the budget could be spent on staff and animation, reducing the possibilities for capacity building and inclusion in that way. The shift to capital grants favoured those with capital, as I've said, and the greater complexity of the application process was also exclusionary. The third element, governance and power, was the most worrying, I suppose, because what I've described is the capture of control by central government and the discarding of the locally generated local development strategy, and that undermined the accountability of leader to local citizens. So in sum, in this LAG area, and I believe in many of the LAG areas in England, a shift from leader as community-led local development and from the leader principles took place towards control through government at a distance, by government far away, with not only a narrower scope than the local development strategy had proposed, but also a far narrower range of beneficiaries. So there's a question which arises out of this. This is just one case study in one member state, though I've been working with some colleagues in other EU countries who have suggested similar sorts of things have happened in their countries. Has LEADER come to reflect governance by hierarchy while presenting as promoting localism and networks? Is the localism more of a fig leaf now to disguise what is actually imposed by government elsewhere? I'll move on to the next slide, please, which is looking ahead. Those are some of the issues that I've done research on over the last 20, 30 years. And I hope that they give some hooks to reflect on in your own experience and to think about in the discussions. But we're also looking ahead as well as looking back in this conference today. And we have on the top left here the vision which the European Commission, the European Union have prepared for Vision for Rural Areas Future. And there's some really good shared goals there. If you look stronger, the connected, the resilient, the prosperous, those are all drawing on what we've learned from LEADER during these 30 years. And the shared goals for 2040, I believe, reflect the LEADER experience. Of course, there are huge challenges ahead, which I've listed just below that, just a few of those challenges. And several research projects have been developing scenarios and developing ideas of what the challenges are. I think these are mainly from the Ruralisation Project, which having all sorts of groups discussing what challenges are and looking at how the priority given to these challenges. These include, of course, the climate change issues, which have been discussed so much in our minds during COP26 in the last couple of weeks, the transition to net zero. There's the impact of the pandemic and the recovery from that, demographic change, aging, migration. There's unequal development and inequality, and quite a few of the things I've already had to say relate to that. There's the challenge of digitalization, which of course in one way reaches into rural areas, but on the other hand is also centralizing services out of rural areas, again with uneven effects on different people. And of course, changes to farm support and reorientation of the CAP. So it seems to me that LEADER has a lot to offer in terms of addressing these challenges and moving towards the vision for 2040 that the EU has identified. A recent report in Scotland for the Scottish Government made some recommendations, of which I've just listed a few on the right here, because I think these are particularly relevant to us today. They recommend building on the experience of LEADER, even though the UK is no longer within the EU. And that includes investment in addressing the needs of rural areas, building on assets and opportunities, maintaining the community-led approach with emphasis on animation, capacity building and networking, indeed more emphasis on animation, capacity building and networking. Innovation as a core principle, understood in the sort of way that I've described, social innovation particularly. The importance of local development strategies and of local participation in its preparation. A better balance between top-down and bottom-up, vertical and horizontal partnerships with responsibilities shared between the different levels and learning networks here between the levels and between different places. Setting out clearer divisions of responsibility and working relationships between governance levels, and importantly, simplified application monitoring and evaluation procedures. So I'll move to my final slide now, James, please, which is in conclusion, just to summarize, Ireland led the way in the early development of LEADER, and we've all benefited right across Europe from that inspirational and pioneering work. We've learned as a result during these 30 years about the importance of local knowledge, of plurality and diversity, of capacity building, local and extra-local networks, social innovation, social inclusion, autonomy, spaces of engagement, governance, and power structures. We've seen that there are huge challenges ahead for rural and for urban societies. I believe that the leader approach should be an important means of enabling local communities to respond actively to these challenges, the more so if they have sufficient autonomy and agency and have the support of an enabling state and learning networks. I look forward to continuing to learn from and be inspired by the Irish experience of leader beyond 30 years and into the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.